You want me to start it, Scott?
Yeah, please.
Okay, stand by.
All right, I think we are good to go. Thank you, everyone, for being here for the Life Finance Committee meeting. This is a follow-up to the meeting that we had a few weeks ago. This, I will tell you the attachments that you have in board docs. Does everyone have access to those? You can get to those. Oh, no.
Yes.
Latest and the greatest. So those have not even been seen by the board yet. So just a quick background on that. You know, we set this meeting up so that through a sequence of events, we could have the best numbers we could possibly have for you at this point in time. So the last payroll run of the fiscal year was last Friday. The last accounts payable run was Monday. We were trying to get everything balanced as best we could. On Tuesday, however, there was a power outage at the board, of course, and for the entire day, a garbage truck backed into a utility pole. So that threw us off just a little bit. So I got final numbers that you see in the forecast now under fiscal year 20 actual. Those came to me last night. I put them in the forecast this morning. They may change just slightly. There could be a little bit of, for example, some minor bank fees or some, I think what else, Eric, my assistant, said there were just a couple of minor things that could still happen. Bank fees or some interest booking or something like that. Nothing major. So what you see is good in terms of fiscal year 20 actual. So I actually even changed in your most recent forecast there, the title is changed to fiscal year 20 actual. And I think maybe the best thing to do would be to go through the questions that Ryan circulated the last time, because they really speak to the major changes that have happened in the forecast since, and then we can address. As always, feel free to jump in at any time. But the first question that Ryan had asked was about tax collections, and you'll remember that we had them originally in previous forecasts. It was around 73 million. Then we had information from the county where we were going to be down 3% for the next fiscal year. They believed in collections. It went back and forth about that, what that should be for this current forecast. Oh, there's Kathy. Hi, Kathy. How are you? Oh, there's Jim too. Hi.
I'm sorry. I had gotten into the meeting early before anybody else was on, and then something happened, and I couldn't get back in. Anyway, all right.
No worries. Good. Glad you're here. So I had explained to everyone that on board docs that all the documents and the attachments are there. Kathy and Jim, are you able to access those? Yeah, they're good. Okay. So at any rate, so we're continuing to look at this property tax matter. And so Ryan had actually just sent another question earlier today, we're trying to get at what the best number is to use for those property tax collections. So let me explain to you what I've done and how we've increased that number to 72,250 for fiscal 21 and forward. I spoke with Brian Dunn at the county, also spoke with Brian Chrisman at Shaker, Michelle Mills at Beechwood, their treasurers of those school districts, just to talk about, you know, what they were doing given the COVID and any expectation of any decrease in property tax revenue. I will say that I was surprised because Brian Dunn at the county told me that they had not reduced our collection rate, our expected collection rate based on COVID at all, which was, I guess, an incorrect assumption that I'd made. That was just based on what they were seeing in the current year, and that's why they moved that forward. So they really don't even look at that I could tell much of a trend back. So what I did was asked him, and they do have the reports out on their website, thankfully, asked him to give me a trend back 5 years. So I went to fiscal 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20 to get a current collection rate percentage and a delinquent collection rate percentage. Did an average of those 5 years. So here, just in round numbers, if we collected 100% of the levy that we are due, or the levies that we're due, we get about $85.5 million, 85.4. So at the time, at the 92%, which that's what the 5-year trend is for current collections, 92%. That's about 78.6 million. They're suggesting that we went, that we would reduce that down to 89.61% collection. That only give us about 76.5 million. So 78.6 versus 76.5. So I just took the average of those two and took the middle number at 77.6. So,
and Scott, is that 89.6 based on the 5-year trend? Is that where it's from?
No, the 92% is 5-year trend. The 89.6, that's the number the county gave us.
Okay.
So what they do is they give us a certificate of estimated resources for the upcoming fiscal year, and they attach a collection percentage that they use for their certificate, and they have our expected collections at 89.61%. So again, he wasn't super clear on how they get to that, other than that's what they were seeing. I assume there are multiple factors in terms of what's going on in the county, what they're seeing in terms of current collections. I got the impression they didn't go back and do a 5-year trend. So that's why I asked them for that. So that's where we get the 92%. So
do we have a document? Do we have a document with that 89.6% number from the county?
We do. Yes.
Is it, and that's on the county website, maybe you said, or
that one? I don't know if that's on the county website, but I have the document from the county here that I can scan and send around. So it's they do what they call a Schedule A and a Certificate of Estimated Resources, and they just tell you, here's that $85 million if you were at 100%, but they have that 89.61 estimate, and that's what they would expect. So that is there. I'll shoot that around everyone. So, I felt comfortable with the 5-year trend based on the conversations we had the last go around. I took the midpoint again between a reduction to that current trend and the actual trend itself to come to 77.6 million. Then I looked at what our delinquent tax collection trend was for the past 5 years. So we did about 4.6% of that total levy and delinquencies every year. That's a 5-year average. So that'd be another $4 million. So, $77.6 million plus another $4 million, we could expect to see $81.6 million in that scenario. And remember, that the state pays part of that homestead and rollback. So the $9.3 million you see in the forecast, that's homestead and rollback. So you take the $81.6 million less the $9.3 million that we're going to get in homestead and rollback. That's where I landed at the 72.3, 72.250 that's in the forecast now. So, I feel like that's a reasonable number, probably a little on the conservative side. As Ryan mentioned, could one assume that because, the current collection percentage has been reduced, that we could see some additional delinquencies down the road? I think that's probably a reasonable assumption. I don't know to what level we would do that or not, but so I would just simply say at this point that's a conservative figure, and if people want to jump in and dissuade me from that one, like I said, it's not my forecast; it's the district. So if we feel otherwise, let me know. I also, in Ryan's notes, in the attachment you have there, I did pull straight out of Shaker's forecast. I'm going to put this in our forecast. I didn't give you the assumptions because I've not updated them at all. I strictly did the forecast. But the example Shaker Heights key forecast assumption for property taxes was there's no decline in property tax assessed valuation during the forecast period, and collection rates remain consistent with recent years, and any coronavirus pandemic impact is only a timing difference over a multi-year period. So I will probably embed a similar statement in our forecast. Just because I do think it's a reasonable assumption for people to think that, and you actually hear that, that people aren't paying their property taxes, they have additional foreclosures, is that going to affect the collection rate? And I think current thinking is that really it's just a matter of timing, and that's where that's going to be. So that was one of the big kind of open items that we did make a change to for this forecast, increasing that real estate tax number. There was a question we talked about with that workers' comp refund, the additional one. Remember, we got 2 this year. One was COVID related. And where was that? Well, I had jumped the gun on that. I put it in the highlights, but the receipt had not happened yet. So that's why it wasn't in the forecast. So you see that, and that was actually taken to the board in their June number 1, 2020, where the miscellaneous revenue was increased by that second workers' comp refund. So that's where that was. I guess the question becomes, do we expect a workers' comp refund in the out years? If you look at the 5-year forecast, if you look under miscellaneous local, 17, we had, in 17, there wasn't one. Those receipts are, E-rate, Medicaid. Then we get a bump in 18 due to workers' comp, and it's there in 19. We get 2 in 20. I dropped it back down to the 17 level for miscellaneous moving forward. But, there's a possibility that we would see some additional workers' comp refunds in the future. I just don't know whether it's reasonable to assume that in the forecast or not, so it did not. Let's see. What else
is that miscellaneous largely driven by workers' comp? Is that?
It is in part. Like, there's a big part of that is Medicaid reimbursement, and also E-rate reimbursement for technology that we put in the district. So that's what it was previous. We have previous numbers at about $1 million level. Then we started getting these workers' comp refunds that bumped that number up in 18, 19, and 2 of them in 20. We also have, there was a question about fringe benefits, and just that, there was can we get more information about the analysis that's happening there? I guess what I can say without committing any unfair labor practices at this time is that that's something that is being discussed in bargaining. Our attorney, and Max would know this as well. You have comparisons that SERB does, you have comparisons to other districts and their plans, and so that's typically what is the methodology that's presented to the bargaining unit to say, here's our plan design, here are others, perhaps from what we consider to be similar or surrounding districts, and we talk about changes that can be made there. So again, I don't want to commit any unfair labor practices, so I'm not going to say anything other than that unless anyone has a question that I might be able to answer related to the fringes.
Scott, I don't have a question, but I think just as a matter of clarification as to what the role is of the Lay Finance Committee and focusing on things like wages and benefits. I mean, it would seem to me that given the, we do want to avoid an unfair labor practice, that it would be helpful to us and our relationship with the community if the board could make clear that that is not our role, for us to insert ourselves in the, not that I wouldn't love to, but that I think that it would just be helpful to have that be out there in writing, but that's not one of our roles.
I understand. I know that some folks have been asking questions about what that role is. So clarity is always a good thing. Let me see, what else do we have here? Salaries and wages, we were talking about, there was a question, and I think we might have addressed it the last time, but just to kind of go back to it, about step increases and why they might cost money or not, given the fact that, the assumption would be if you have a teacher on step 15 and they're retiring and you're going to replace them with a a younger teacher, that the differential, might be a savings in that regard and might offset some of that step increase. So really, it really depends on the distribution and age of your teachers in terms of years of experience and how they're moving up those steps. So that's why we have, I actually went through by teacher because we were bargaining and I wanted to have a very exact number. For our purpose of the forecast, I rounded it to $600,000, but I went through and took the cost of where each teacher was on the salary schedule, stepped them to get that cost. So $600,000 was the step cost for both teachers and classified. But remember that teachers not only step based on years of experience, but they can step across a scale based on advanced degrees, which obviously they're encouraged to do. So there are multiple iterations, both vertically and horizontally, on a salary schedule for those step increases. And so what we ended up doing for some of the reductions that we had last year was, we didn't replace teachers. We simply used that. If there was a retirement and we didn't need that, based on licensure, obviously, but if we didn't need that teacher, we didn't replace them. So that teacher exiting the organization rather than being replaced and coming in on step 1 versus step 15 and seeing that savings, we didn't see that way. We saw the savings by the teacher exiting the organization and retiring, and that's where we captured that savings. Does that make sense? Because I know, again, it does make sense that you would expect that you would have some retirements, but not as many as you might expect because, STRS went to 35 years versus 30 not long ago. So, they have teachers staying in the business a little longer than they typically would. And, a lot of teachers that I know, get concerned about healthcare as well, if they're going to retire and often will stay with the organization longer so that they don't have a health care or an insurance issue. So we have some teachers that may be retiring, but you have a whole bunch of teachers, again, depending on the age and experience of the teachers, who are stepping on a 15 step scale or might be stepping horizontally. So that's why we have an increase there based on steps. Any questions?
Scott, does the $600,000 take into account any additional education?
It does. So that's both. Yeah, so that's it's the steps that I did here. That part was strictly an estimate because we don't know what those people might be getting. So there was a part of that $600,000 that was strictly the steps based on years of experience, and the remainder was strictly an estimate based on possible movement for additional education and also for classified staff. Because they step on a scale as well. That's not as easy to predict because you have a lot of movement in classified ranks. So it was more like it was roughly a $500,000 of a firm step that we knew, and then an additional $100,000 based on education or classified steps. So that's kind of where we came with that number. There was a question about purchase orders, and so. This is still in process, but we have really wanted to make sure that we did not run into the same issue that we ran into last year. You will recall where we had about $3 million in purchase orders that had carried over from the previous year into this last school year. And then a lot of those purchase orders ended up being closed or not needed, and it freed up money, which isn't a bad thing, but certainly it can throw off the projection. So what we did is we've been really hammering the departments to say, here we've actually been reviewing, or my staff has been reviewing with the various departments, every purchase order to say, here's what we see. Is this still necessary? Is there still an outstanding invoice that we're waiting for? If not, we're going to close it or we're going to reduce it. So you see in the new forecast, the encumbrances at 1.7 million. I have that there as estimated in parentheses because, again, until probably our meeting next week, I won't have a firm number for outstanding encumbrances, but we started at over 3 million and we were down under, I think the last number I saw was just under 2. But I think that the goal is that somewhere between 1.5 and 1,750 is where those encumbrances are going to land. So I put 1,750 in there as a placeholder. I'll have a firm number next week. But those will be actual and true, legitimate expenses that, are invoices that we're waiting for. A lot of times it'll be utilities if you're waiting for utility bills, if you have outstanding legal invoices, whatever you might have, those are district-wide obligations that we still would need to pay, which is one time. And and so someone brought up the Peterson, the autism scholarship trend, and whether that was appropriate or reasonable. So thank you for that, because I did go back and speak with our pupil services department. We had that, you'll remember, in the last forecast increasing about $100,000 a year, but really trend would show that it should be going up around 3. So I did bump that up a little bit. Now there was a question, which again is a good one, from someone here on the committee saying, well, would there be, if those students are exiting, would you be saving perhaps a staff person that you might not need to serve those students? The problem we're seeing with the Peterson and autism scholarships are much the same as Ed Choice. Our students that we're currently serving aren't opting to take these. It's students who never came who are accessing the scholarships. So there's not an opportunity for us to react and as an organization and say, okay, well, we don't need a teacher now, or we don't need a paraprofessional, or we don't need this staff person or that staff person, because these are students that weren't with us, really. So they're residents, they can access the scholarship, but they're not necessarily someone who's with us and is just choosing to take the money and go somewhere else for services. So no savings there, unfortunately. It's exactly the Ed Choice argument that we've had, where people and legislators are saying, well, gosh, yeah, you're saying you're losing money, but then, when those kids leave, you don't have them anymore. So can't you cut teachers, and can't you do this, and can't you do that? They're students who never came. 94% of the Ed Choice students never attended here. So it's not even like we're losing students and we can say, okay, finally we can, have a teacher, we can close a building, we can do any of those kinds of things. So I did make a slight adjustment with that up. And the last question that we had from last time was kind of, are there additional costs or savings from COVID, and what's that going to look like? And that, I'm sorry to say, is still a huge question mark. In dropping the actual numbers in here and comparing them to budget a little bit today, some of the things that jump out at me is that we did save a little bit of money, but not as much as I might have expected. And maybe it was because at the point in the year when we finally, COVID hit, the bulk of the money was either encumbered or spent. But there was some savings in utilities. Transportation for students was probably the biggest savings I saw, about $100,000 less than what was budgeted. We did see, a little bit of savings in, for example, travel and meeting expense, or or property services. But where I really expected to see the big savings and didn't was in substitute costs. And so, I suppose on the one hand, it's a good thing that we didn't finish out the school year, because our substitute costs would have been much greater than what was budgeted, because we were at budget by the time we went out with COVID. So that's one of those things that I feel like we need to talk to human resources about and really kind of dig into and see whether that was some long-term absences that required some long-term subs, and if that was driving that, or whether they were one-off utilization. What it was, I'm not sure. But we definitely need to take a look at that, because traditionally the end of the school year is when our vacancies would be more, and we would tend to have more subs. So, and that's where I was hopeful that we were going to see some savings, but we didn't really see it there. So, but what school is going to look like in the fall is still undecided. And, the district has Jim, I can't remember the name of the committee. It's the reentry, committee that the superintendent is leading to try to talk to stakeholders and the educators to figure out what school is going to look like in the fall. And there are a lot of decisions that need to be made pretty quickly, and I think people were waiting for guidance from the governor, and he's not giving it. So that's not helpful. So we don't know exactly what school is going to look like, whether it's going to be a hybrid model with some virtual learning, with some, in person, what social distancing is going to look like. We've had some conversations about if there are property needs like, plexiglass and, personal protective equipment and whatnot. And I see you said that, they're planning for multiple options. If there's money that's necessary there, we could always access permanent improvement funds for that versus general funds. So that maybe, some of those costs could stay out of the general fund. I know I just saw an approval for some additional Chromebooks at the very young elementary level, and I think as possible distance learning. That's coming from PI funds. That's not general fund. So I don't have a good answer to that question. I think that's something that we're just going to have to kind of monitor as we go and see what school is going to look like and whether that's going to be more or less money. I think there's a big fear right now about transportation and what that looks like, because there's certainly, if you have to do social distancing on a bus, we don't have enough buses to do that with the number of students we have. So it tricky. And so I'm not quite sure what that is going to look like. So those are the kinds of things that committee is really talking through, is what the options are and what it might look like. But it's already nearly July, and I don't know if you all saw, but there was there's a proposal for the calendar to shift for the next school year. So school will start after Labor Day. So the teachers will start a week ahead like they typically would, but the students would start after Labor Day. And that first week will be dedicated to trying to make sure that, that teachers and staff are, have enough professional development for whatever kind of model of education is going to be happening, or if there is cleaning of buildings that has to happen in advance of people coming, or whatever needs there are. The plan is to get the staff in the building ahead of time. And so they're kind of rearranged where there's really no loss of education or student contact time. And I think taking advantage of some of these virtual opportunities for students to make sure that works, but that we can have the staff in early and then the students come later. So those are kind of the big changes, I guess, or questions that I know we still had outstanding. Are there others that have come up since the last meeting? I mean, I know we were going to talk about the income tax possibility too, but I just wanted to, in terms of the forecast and what that looks like, is there anything else that anyone wants to throw out there to discuss?
Hey, Scott.
Mr. Posh.
The CARES Act money.
Yes.
Where does that show up in the new forecast?
We have used that money to reduce expenditures. So, the initially I put the CARES Act under, there was a federal receipts from federal sources, and I just plugged the $1.2 million up there as revenue coming in. We've actually requested the money and have started charging that money against expenses. So it's reducing expenses rather than being a source.
Scott,
that's a good question. I should have mentioned that. Sorry.
Scott, I that's funny because when I look at the June number 1 and I look in tuition / catastrophic costs, I saw 4.2, and then in June number 2 it's up to 5.5. And that was almost exactly the 1.2 million of CARES money. So I had assumed that it might go.
No, that's not there. That actually was, so there were some, and you'll see in thank you for bringing that up, Ryan. So you'll see in fiscal 21 too, that there's actually a bump of about 500. Yeah. So there are some direct pay tax settlements. So when you see tuition catastrophic costs and that other category are some direct payments that are property related, but they don't fall under the real estate tax receipt code. So we had a pretty large amount of these tax settlements come in 20, and then just today, so this is again hot off the press, I asked our real estate counsel to send me any remaining direct pay amounts. And so so we have 559,100 between July 31st of 20 and March 1st of 2021. So that's what that is. But I should have pointed that out. I'm sorry, because that would have been a reasonable assumption to think that 1.2 got pulled in there because it's a similar number.
So are these things like, top of the hill? Is that what you mean by tax settlements? Or
there is some of that. So the South, so another good point, because I just saw today, top of the hill was breaking ground. I knew the superintendent was there yesterday, I think, for the groundbreaking. So there are some income tax payments that are happening that are in that other number along the way, Ryan, for Cedar Center. So that is in there. Okay. Cedar Center, and this is where I've struggled a little bit, and I'm landing on the conservative side here. At some point, I think the last income tax amount we get from Cedar Center is in fiscal 21, and then we're supposed to be receiving property taxes from there instead. And it's supposed to be in an amount greater than what we would be seeing in income tax, but we have some concern because we only get to see that money if they have sufficient revenue to pay their debt service first and then pay us. And so that's something we are asking for some information about and trying to dig into a little bit. So in some of the very late years of this forecast, in the 23-24, we could start seeing a little additional property tax revenue for Top Hill. I know that project is supposed to, if it's on time, be done in 22, and at some point in calendar 22, and then so we would start seeing some money in 23 for that, and I think it's about $400,000 that's expected. But also, yeah, Cedar Center is. Then University Square, there's really not anything significant coming to the district that would impact the forecast in any way, but. Yes, that's the kind of stuff that falls up under that number.
Hey, Scott, can you just remind us on the salaries and wages, what's going into the forecast for the increases between fiscal year 21, 22, 23, and 24? I mean, there's increases, which is
there's zero cost of living in here. There is no step increase in fiscal 21. And then steps are assumed for fiscal 22 forward.
Okay.
Scott, is there a basis for that? Is the board asked you to make that assumption? That seems that seems like it's the opposite of conservative.
Mr. Posh, do you want to go there with that one?
I think the board's opinion right now is in this financial climate, we cannot assume that we can afford to give raises, especially when we look at the levy failure in the spring, and you look at all our increased costs due to COVID, as well as and choice, uncertainty of the state budget, I mean, the state got part of our funding this year at the end of the year. I mean, we can't be in a position as a public entity to increase salaries and raises through bonuses, not bonuses, but through cost of living increases at this time. I mean, maybe there would be negotiation pressure that might change that. I expect the pressure to be there. But I really don't think our community is going to stand for, at least in the next year, salary benefit increases. And I think the board is with that.
And I think that you know, the assumption being that if there were cost of living increases that were to happen, that they would be offset by perhaps, you know, some change in benefits or paid from, you know, in some other way. So if there was some reduction in insurances, for example, it could then turn around and be used as a cost of living increase. I suppose that's a possibility, but it's just, I think the assumption is that if anything happened for a cost of living, again, the steps are in there except for next year. The steps are in there, but if there was anything like a COLA, it would have to be, you know, somehow paid for from savings somewhere else.
Scott, are the increases in the fringe benefits just an estimate as to increases in the cost?
They are, yes. Yeah, so we still
not
use
not increases in terms of percentages, you know, paid and that sort of thing, but just the business of healthcare and
correct. Yeah. So we still use Cheryl Broadway, who's been with our organization. She predates me in terms of our healthcare consultant. So she kind of facilitates our insurance committee. She helps us work with the carriers, troubleshoots claims and those kinds of things. So she's the one who gives us trend for any healthcare increases. And I we'll have to grab the assumption, but I think it was right now we're assuming about 5% annual based on our trend. We are self-insured, just to remind everyone of that.
So I had one more question about the 5-year forecast.
Yes, sir.
I know that there were some significant cuts made by the board, you know, recently, that in some ways, you know, arguably pulled forward the 750 they were attempting to make each year. So I, you know, not having watched all of the board meetings, you know, my question is whether the board is still committed to 750 each year, or if in some ways in the minds of the board, well, we made more than that. So that kind of carries over, because this forecast seems to assume another 750 each year.
You're absolutely correct.
The upcoming year. So I just wasn't sure if that's still what the board is saying they are going to do, or if there's been a change.
So Ryan, if we were a corporation just trying to make ends meet without even factoring any kind of profitability, we would be in the mode right now, if you looked at this forecast, to cut salaries, cut benefits, find a way to pay services. I mean, I think with the typical negotiation pressure that we're under, it's unrealistic to assume us actually cutting salaries. I think it is reasonable to assume to keep things the same. I think with the benefits, we're going to absolutely have to see some movement on the benefits. And on top of all that, we're going to have to find additional cuts. I mean, when you say we committed to the 750, I can't see us. We're going to have to reach for a higher number. I mean, I just can't see how we can't. So I mean, we were able to get to. We were. I mean, we were evaluating Liz and Scott, and we were talking about um, finances, and the 2+ million cuts we made this year were really, really hard to make. But we're going to have to find more. I mean, we just don't have any choice at this point. So yeah, we're committed to making those and probably more. What they look like, I don't know at this time.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's I guess a good segue into I kind of wanted to show, unless there are any other questions about the forecast specifically, what the Millage would show because as you can see from the forecast, although we've gained in some areas and lost in others, it at the end of fiscal 21, where we have $3.2 million to the good, which isn't even a single payroll, and then the deficit in fiscal 22 of almost 9.2 million. So I can't certify but a 1-year contract with the teachers. That's why we're only bargaining a 1-year contract right now. But there's still a need for money. And so the need for a levy hasn't gone away. The question is timing and what that looks like. So
Well, let me I don't know if I'll make a few comments, and then I do know we want to talk a little bit about income tax.
Yeah, go ahead.
I will note, looking at the 5-year forecast, I went back and looked at the September 2019 forecast, which was, I believe, the last forecast that this committee saw before it made its millage recommendation. And the number we were focused on at that time was kind of end of year, the fiscal year 23 is what we had kind of targeted. And at that time, the fiscal year 23 closing cash balance was 24 million. And I think part of our levy calculation was intended to fill that hole. We worked backwards to some extent. And I would note that if you look at Scott's recent forecast and where we end up at the end of fiscal year 23, we're at 23.5 rounded. So in many ways, while a lot has changed, the bottom line hasn't as far as the size of the hole we're trying to fill over the next 3 fiscal years. So, I mean, that was one thing that stuck, popped out at me, when I looked at this.
No, that's a good observation, Ryan. I actually hadn't looked back at that forecast at the time. You're right. That's just about where we are, and I guess that was the frustrating piece for the administration and the board and the district is when you is having to or trying to make those additional cuts, trying to get ahead, trying to reduce the millage. Really, the 2.5 million that we went after in cuts was over the concern that the last levy may have failed, and if so, what can we do to make the millage for a future act smaller? But instead, we lose, we have additional ed choice money, significantly more than we would have expected coming out. The state makes their cut. The feds give us some money to offset that, but not all of that. So it is you're right. A lot has changed, but it remains the same, I guess, in the end.
So Ryan, so I'm looking at that September 2019 forecast, and one of the big numbers that's sticking out for me is the salary and wages line.
Yeah.
So that was basically 63.5. We're at 59.2. So it's essentially a $4 million difference, and we still have that level of hurt. I mean, if we had built salary and wage numbers at 1 or 2%, I think you had a 10 for 2% increase. So at that point, we would be the numbers, the bottom line number that you're looking at in the forecast that Scott just gave us in fiscal year 23, basically the 23.5 would be, well, you compound that, I mean, you'd be up to 30 easily, if not.
And Jim, I would point out that the Ed Choice voucher number from that old forecast was 6.2 million, and the Ed Choice voucher number for our current forecast is $4 million higher. I mean, you can almost say we took $4 million from the teachers to give to the private schools.
Well, it's money the teachers don't have yet, so we have to away.
Yes.
And this isn't about taking things away from teachers. I mean, this is district wide. This is affecting administrators. I mean, the issue here is we can only pay with the amount of money that we actually get in. Did try pretty hard to pass a school levy this time, and the results were miserable. Some are going to say they were COVID related, but COVID is still here. I don't know. It's a dire situation, really, when you look at it.
Well, and I will say that I know, Jody is the board president. Liz and I all three received, multiple letters from education saying, we see your May forecast. We see that, we see the deficit. First of all, they see how close fiscal 21 runs to the end there. I think in the May forecast, it might have been, at around 2 million. It's a little better than that currently, but still they're saying that's very close. Just be reminded that you cannot end a year in a deficit. So, make sure to monitor that, but also asking us for a plan. What are you going to do to address fiscal 22? So that's kind of where we are with that.
Now, I guess I did have one further question, and my guess is we don't have an answer to it, but that is, I did spend some time this week trying to figure out what the state of Ohio might be proposing for the upcoming fiscal year in its budget, and I failed to find anything that helped me understand that. So just, not expecting that anybody has anything, definitive, certainly nothing definitive, but I don't know if Jim or Scott, you have any word or any sense of whether we should expect state monies to go up or down based off the forecast.
Yeah, we've seen no, and Jim may have heard something different, but I've seen nothing from any of our state organizations or any of our legislators that would suggest that we're going to see any additional money. And the House Bill 164 that just passed did kind of look at the cuts that already happened to districts, and if they were over a certain percentage, it kind of gave a little money back to some of those districts. Didn't help us at all, because unfortunately the amount of the cut versus the level of state aid that we get wasn't enough to help us out. So I've seen nothing else though related to that. I know that same legislation originally had the ability to furlough employees in it. So that would give districts some flexibility to deal with these shortfalls that they have, and that was taken out. So that's not there any longer. And so I have not heard anything good. I have nothing to share. Jim, you?
Well, the only thing that I'm worried about is they've essentially capped our funding, and that there's more community members, whether you're going into our buildings or whether you're using a voucher, that are utilizing our resources. So, if the state can release the cap, that could be helpful. But we've cried and pleaded with the state and gone down to Columbus multiple times, and we had legislators telling us, oh, well, we understand your situation. And when the decisions, and these are from both sides of the aisle, but when the decisions get made, they're not helpful. And I think we just have to go with the assumption that, at best, it'll stay the same. Worst case, it'll get worse. Well, obviously it'll get worse.
But this does assume continuing at the same level as this past fiscal year, where we did take the hit at the end of the year.
It does.
Okay.
So we're assuming, and this is kind of what I've consistently heard from districts, is that the assumption is that that things will remain at that level and at a reduced level. I know some districts are fearful that, they made for us, it was $1.4 million cut in those last couple of months of this school year. Will they make an even bigger cut for a full school year for next year or not? I think traditionally everyone's decided that they're really just not going to, that's unlikely. That what's most likely scenario is that we'll be where we are now, and not better, unfortunately. Any other comments or questions about the forecast? Did you want to get into some income tax conversation first, or do you want to see kind of where we stand in terms of a millage model? What makes most sense for you?
I think we should talk a little bit about the income tax, because I don't think there's a long discussion to be had. I could be wrong. But I think maybe we could, Kathy, if you want to start with what you found, and I know you had shared that with some of us.
And that should be an attachment. Kathy, you're on mute. There's an attachment too that has Kathy's findings.
Well, I think what I found is simply that this went down, by a lot in 1990, but that was a long time ago. I think since then they added two different possibilities for how you calculate the income that are subject to the tax, but in both cases it's similar to income for state tax purposes. There may be one that is a little bit more like weighted toward wages, toward earned income, and maybe does not include investment income. I'm not sure about that. The statutes are pretty complicated, and also looking up on the state's, the tax department website, the instructions for this were complicated. But so it doesn't work like a municipal wage tax. It's more like the state income tax.
Yeah, I mean, the election results were just really shocking. How about 30% to 70% on an income tax. It looks like in a period of time where other levies, property tax levies, were roughly 50-50. So it was really surprising to me.
I don't think I was on the lay finance committee at that time. I can't remember why you tried the income tax instead of an additional property tax. Do you know why that is, Scott? Was that before your time also?
It was. So that I'm not sure what the thinking was at that time. I will say, to Kathy's point, I did reach out to one of your colleagues, Kathy, Mike Sharp, just today.
Former colleague.
Former colleagues, I should say. Sorry.
I'm sorry.
And
I miss him. He's a great guy. So.
He is. And so I just shot him an email this morning, and he got right back to me just to say, hey, the committee is having some conversation about income tax tonight. Could you share your thoughts? And so let me read to you real quickly what he said. He says, Scott, for a district like yours, the biggest weakness of a school district income tax, whether on a traditional, meaning income of individuals and estates, or on an earned income, which excludes passive income. So to Kathy's point, there are different varieties, is that businesses have no obligation completely. They pay no tax. So, the school district income tax is different than the income taxes most people are familiar with, state and city, which do reach business profits. And in the case of city tax, reach non-residents. The school district income tax is a tax on resident individuals only. This is why the school district income tax is most popular in less urban, more rural areas, where many farmers, etc., are land rich but income poor. In more urban areas where there's more commercial activity, they are far less common because it does not tap into business income. He said, and he goes on to say, the other reason I see, it used is because it produces income without affecting the 20 mil floor, but it's a part of the state formula that isn't applicable to us. He says that, I mean, he winds up saying, my take would be that a school district income tax is not a great solution for the school district unless there's clear articulation that's being used to balance an overall commercial tax burden, which there isn't one. And I had asked him about Euclid specifically, which I think we talked about because they do have an income tax in place. He said, finally, note that the income tax in Euclid is a completely different animal and no longer available in the form that was put into place there.
Well, and I did spend a little bit of time looking at this. One of the things I found is completely in line with what you just read, Scott, and that is, I looked at the list of all of the districts in the state that have an income tax, and there isn't a single, if you search by county, so if you just look at Cuyahoga and Hamilton and Franklin, you will get a few hits. Stark, you will get a few hits, but almost all of the school districts that have an income tax are really on the very fringe of the county. I didn't see a single inner ring suburb in the state of Ohio that appears to have an income tax. So I think that really buttresses what you just read. That just factually, nobody else is doing this. It's tough to figure out, when I looked for white papers or other research as to exactly why, there isn't a lot out there that I was able to find. I certainly think while you hear the argument that retirees can be harmed by, additional property taxes, I think of, the working poor or the middle class really being hit strongly by an income tax. And, maybe most districts when weighing, the impact on those two constituencies, reach a conclusion that maybe, it is a hit on property owners, but maybe that's preferable to the alternative. So, I read a lot of stuff, but I didn't read anything I felt was worthy of sharing with the committee, but that is kind of what I found when I looked at this. It did make me believe that it was, I came out of it thinking an income tax wasn't something I thought was right for our district.
Have you had people ask you that, or to suggest that our committee should consider an income tax? Did you hear what I said?
Yeah, I'm trying to unmute right now, and I wasn't able to answer that. I mean, the board member.
I thought Ryan had been approached, or maybe he was approached by a board member. I don't know. Go ahead.
Well, we just know some board members have been approached, and I brought it to this committee, asked this committee to look at it. So, and I'm going to get back to the board and basically, tell them some of the reasons that it seems like it doesn't make any sense.
Well, just as a matter of process, I mean, it was my conclusion that it doesn't make sense. I mean, I think Scott is, just read the outside advice. I mean, he's not giving a recommendation, but does anybody on the committee think it merits further discussion or sees certain things that we haven't discussed?
I don't think so. I mean, for the same reasons that you were saying earlier, I think it kind of disproportionately hits people who are, already. I mean, there is poverty in Cleveland Heights, and those people would be paying additional taxes. A lot of them are renters. From my perspective, I don't think I don't know. I think we're just more successful, going with the millage model and the property tax levy.
I can't picture that model. I can't picture that model passing. Trying to explain it to people after this is what they're used to, I just can't imagine that even being successful.
Yeah, I'm not positive about this, but I think that school district income tax might also be a tax on unemployment compensation. I know that unemployment compensation is subject to both federal and state income tax. And so I think that this probably could hit those people too at a bad time.
Yeah, that's a good point, Kathy. Mike doesn't mention that specifically, but that's entirely possible. Yeah. Okay, well, then Jim, any further income tax conversation, or Ryan, that we need to have now, or we're going to leave this alone? Okay, in terms of process, folks, then where do you want to go from here? Do you want to look at some millage models based on the current forecast, or if that makes sense?
Yes, I would request maybe Scott, you share your screen and show us a millage model.
Can do.
And afterwards, I would appreciate if you could circulate the model around to the group just so we have
Absolutely.
a record of it and can make sure we're comfortable with how it works.
I'm going to drop out in about 5 minutes, guys, and I will watch the rest on playback. Okay.
Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, Adam.
All right, can everyone see this?
Yes.
Okay, because I don't have dual screens, so can't see your smiling faces. But so this is the forecast that we just talked about, June number 2. So if you look at a millage model, I've got 2 down here. One, if the district goes for a levy yet in calendar 20, and then one if we delay until 21. So if we go in 20, this model would suggest 8.5 mils. And all things equal and everything in the forecast playing out exactly as it is predicted there. And then if there's a wait until fiscal 21, that jumps to 14.2 mils. So what I did do, just real quickly for the purposes of conversation, and this may be something more that the board will want to tinker with, but the cuts we have right now embedded in the forecast are at that 750,000 annually. So 750 that carries forward, another 750 starting in this year, and then a third 750 in fiscal 24. So I just put here, for purposes of looking at the mill mods, well, what would happen if the board determined that we would cut 1.5 million versus the 750, and that's 1.5 million in 22, mind you, and then the 750 just another 750 in 23 and another 750 in 24. So that drops your millage to 7.9 if we were to go in 20, and drops the millage down to 13.4 in 21. Again, any number can be plugged in here. So if, for example, we made $3.5 million in cuts, what does that look like? In that case, that drops us to 6.5 mils if we go in 20, and down to 11 for 21. So any number, again, we can drop in here and tinker with this, but that's kind of what we're looking at based on the current situation. Any questions or any number that people want to see thrown in there?
Yeah. What is the impact of waiting until early in 2021 to put a levy on the ballot?
Yeah, so if we don't go in 20 until 21, which means that we're not going to see we'll see only a half-year collection in 22. We're going to have to address this, the deficit that sits here in 22. We can't have it. So, then that becomes a question of, what additional cuts are necessary to address a $9.2 million deficit in 22. I would say that it probably is going to require some additional cuts in 21, which are limited based on where we are in the fiscal year, and the fact that teachers are in place and there's only a window in the spring that you can do what you're going to do, and there's no legislation to let us furlough people. But what in 22, we have again this $9.2 million deficit that we can't have. So, what would that look like if we would go on? If we don't go on in 20, we go on in 21, calendar 21, and then we have to figure out what we do to address that.
Well, we are.
Can I ask?
Sorry, go ahead, Max.
I was going to ask, well, what, I mean, so I don't know the history of this as well as a lot of people on this committee. What would be the pros and cons, and what kind of millage would we need, if we were just to, get it through 2022, fiscal 2022, or is that just like totally off the table? Like we need to do it through 2023. Is that absolutely necessary?
That's a good question. So typically we have gone at a 3-year cycle, but it's possible to do shorter. I think I wouldn't see why not. The millage would be lower. Just it would only address the deficit for the for that through that year. Yeah, we would do some calculations to see what that would look like. I guess the obvious downside would be that we would have to be back sooner to voters than later.
Right. I'm just thinking with the economic situation the way that it is, and so many people's employment kind of up in the air. I'm just trying to think, put myself in the shoes of somebody, a voter who would say no to, 7.9 or 8.5 in this model, or 13.4 if we wait until 21. I'm just trying to think if it's lower, if it's something like 4 or 5 mills to get us through a year, and then next year we may know better what the economic situation is going to be. I don't know. People might feel more comfortable with passing a longer term kind of levy in calendar year 21.
I just personally, I think it's definitely something worth looking at. I mean, you can certainly argue that there's more uncertainty in your forecast, Scott, than is normal.
Correct.
When it comes to ed choice and how that could change either for better or worse, and state funding and federal funding and the additional costs from COVID. I mean, these forecasts could be off by millions of dollars in either direction through no fault of you, but just the nature.
Sure. No, you're right. Absolutely.
Is there an easy way for you to tweak the levy model 2020 to see how we just fill the $9.2 million hole instead of the $23 million hole? Watching an accountant change a spreadsheet, it makes us all, this is exactly what we wanted to be doing. So
Yeah.
you're in the 2021 tab. Are you in that tab intentionally?
Oh, sorry. Nope, I am not. So I think the easiest way to do it would probably be just to
And then divide it by 1.5, right?
right, because we would be going, if we went in 20, we'd have a half a year collection in 21 and a full year in 22. 5.6.
And I would think in that scenario, you'd maybe not want to end at 0. You'd want a little cushion. I mean, if the idea is that there's uncertainty. So I'm
Right.
not,
Yeah, nope, that's a good point. Yep, so that's definitely a possibility. If that's something that, I don't know, Mr. Posh, if you had a...
I think it's something that we need to bring to the board as an option. I mean, I think any reasonable option right now we need to be looking at.
Okay, well, I know we in terms of moving forward, I know we had tentatively set another meeting for our next, I want to say Wednesday, is that the 1st? Because we wanted to have at least one more opportunity before the board meets on July 7th. Yeah, Wednesday, July 1st, we have held. So if there are various scenarios or models that you want to see, or think about or think through, you know, you tell me how you want to proceed and what you want me to provide for you, and we'll be happy to do that.
Well, let me, Scott, the one question I did have about the model, and now that you've changed it, maybe you have to undo a few of the changes, but with roughly, you know, I thought the whole was about the same, and so I expected us to get closer to 7.9 mils. And maybe I'm wondering if I was wrong that we were using the September forecast when we did the last mill model. You know, the process we used last time was the same process that the process that we eventually settled on was the same process that you had baked in. I imagine you just pulled the old one.
Right. Yep.
But that would, you know, if we use the exact same process as last time, we're ending up at 8.5. So it's not like we're writing on a blank slate. I mean, that is what we did last time. But I would ask for you to try to figure out why that wouldn't land closer to 7.9, and I'll do the same on my end.
Yeah, absolutely. Can do.
Can I offer this? I think it would be helpful if that mill model spreadsheet, Scott, you can share with the committee. And I think there is probably some reason for this group to meet before the board meeting, just so you can maybe do a little homework and kind of come up with, you know, a series of scenarios that you may feel comfortable with. I mean, I think those scenarios will need to include some. I'm uncomfortable to have you guys recommend cuts. Well, how about this? I mean, why don't I throw it out to you guys? I mean, do you think your role is to recommend some cuts to try to balance one of these mill models?
It's hard to recommend cuts. I guess I will say, just for myself, and you know, having worked at least indirectly in the school arena for a number of years, I don't feel like I know enough about the actual operations of a school district to in any kind of knowledgeable way recommend cuts. I have no idea how much you would save, for example, if you were to change your busing arrangement, you know, that sort of thing. I'm uncomfortable with that. On the other, I also would like to say, though, that I'm extremely uncomfortable recommending any kind of a tax levy this year. That, you know, our country is in a crisis. We have no idea where this pandemic is headed. Right now, it's headed downhill. We don't know what's going to be going on with the economy. A lot of people are already unemployed and with skills that aren't usable and won't be probably for a couple of years. And I think we have a lot of people like that in our district. People who are in the arts, in the performing arts, for example. I mean, they're just dead in the water. Jim, you talked about what would we do if we were a corporation. I mean, one of the things we wouldn't do would be to raise our prices in this kind of an economy. And I'm very uncomfortable with it. But if we don't put some kind of levy on the ballot, then what we are doing is to me, we are telling the board, we think you should make cuts.
I agree with Kathy, at least in the, I may be a little more comfortable putting a levy on the ballot, maybe a shorter term or 1 year, looking at different scenarios. But I also think I know that I am not knowledgeable enough about the operation of the school district day to day. You know, if I looked through the 5-year forecast and just took a line item and say, well, what if we were to cut, 10% out of this and then 20% out of this to try and make up this $9 million hole or $23 million hole, I don't know what effect that's going to have on the teachers and the staff and the students. So yeah, I'm not comfortable making particular cuts myself.
Can I clarify my comment about the cuts? I was not suggesting that this group would, look at the budget and, for example, say, well, you spend X million on transportation, that has to go. We know transportation, for example, educationally, it guarantees that kids get in the building. Our test scores increase because of that for a lot of different, crazy reasons. Kids get better outcomes because they're in our buildings and they get to school on time. So when I said cuts, we just have some bottom line numbers, the 750, essentially in 22, 23, and 24. All I was suggesting was, well, you can get away with a 7.9 mil levy, but in order to balance your books, you're going to have to make 4 million in cuts. I mean, I'm pulling a number out of thin air. Likewise, if you don't go on the ballot in at the end of this year in 22, and you wait to 20, you don't go in the ballot on the end of 21, but you go in 22. That is just going to mean that the cuts that you make in 22 are going to have to be deeper in order to. I mean, that's the scenario that I'm looking at, not specific cuts in educational programs.
I see. That makes sense.
I really want to leave those to Liz and Scott to make.
I'll be honest, Jim, it's hard to come up with any kind of target unless you know whether there is something to be cut. If I can come up with a number. I mean, if you're just saying provide us with alternatives, we can say, well, if you assume no cuts, this would be if you think no cuts are achievable, this is the millage we'd recommend. If you think $1 million a year is achievable, this is the millage we'd recommend. I'm completely comfortable with that, but I would need significantly more information to understand whether there is $1 million to be cut. And I don't see a way past what Kathy said, frankly. I understand in theory you could stay at a higher level, but when you actually say, how do we do that? I don't see how it doesn't just kind of collapse back into what Kathy suggested was the problem, which was we don't really know from where we sit kind of what's underneath some of these numbers and where there's something that could be cut. So,
yeah, I know from past campaigns that they're, the lay people have a lot of assumptions about ways that you could cut costs, and that when you actually analyze them, people who know what they're doing analyze them. It turns out that doesn't save any money at all. It triggers additional costs elsewhere. I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but one of the things that we don't know about yet is that something like the HEROES Act has to pass, or this country is just going to be, a failed state. And that could be extremely helpful to public school districts. And I think also we see a big change happening politically, maybe not locally, maybe not in the state, but certainly nationally. I think there's really a sea change happening, and I'm optimistic about that. That maybe in a year from now, things are going to really, people still be dying, but that it may be that our populace will be just a little bit more, constructively focused on solutions.
Well, I tend to think we should. I don't know that changes any of the numbers though that we are looking at now. I don't think we should say, well, politics are changing, so we we should put into this forecast that we're going to get more revenue because we think that might happen.
No, I don't-
I mean, I don't see
No.
anything, that really changes our mission as a committee and what we would recommend. But,
No, I think it would be justification for punting for a while. That's about all I would be able to say. And that this is a bad time. Maybe it's a good time to be putting a levy on the ballot if it's a relatively small levy because it's a presidential election. It's going to be a big turnout.
Well, I guess I view this a little different. That I don't really ignoring the politics of it. Delaying seems to have significant consequences for the millage you have to request. I mean, you're talking about a millage that's never been heard of before. So I really worry about punting or delaying and then just really asking the voters for something that they've never been asked for in the history of the district. Seems to me to be a pretty big risk.
I definitely would say that I think that if the committee or the board decides to delay, that it absolutely would necessitate a significant number of cuts, because to Ryan's point, you couldn't go and ask for a double-digit millage at any point, And so the response would be, if the best thing to do is delay, then you need to look at, okay, so what kind of cuts are necessary to make that delay palatable or have reasonable millage at the end of all that.
I don't want to at all give the impression that I think that any of this would be a good idea, the cuts or anything, but I think you have to look around and you see all the cities are making cuts, the counties are making cuts, the state is making cuts.
Absolutely.
We can expect that school districts will be spared.
Yeah, and we've, and that's kind of really to Jim's point, one of the things we've been saying to the organization, even in the context of bargaining, and again, but just to say, the forecast for work, and these are the times we're working in, and our friends and families are losing jobs and being furloughed and taking pay cuts, and that's just the reality of things now. And so, we're not in a bubble. So I can certainly, get some different numbers together, share the mill mods so that everyone can kind of do what they want to do with those things. Is a follow-up meeting next Wednesday workable for people? Do we think that's okay? And then Jim, to your point, that'll give the committee another opportunity to meet, discuss whatever it is we want to discuss, and then be able to give some feedback to the board for the July 7th board meeting.
Well, and Jim, just let me know if this is incorrect. I mean, last time we felt comfortable making a recommendation, and it was kind of a single track recommendation. It was at least 7.9 mils is what we recommended. I think the board is looking for us to make some sort of presentation and hopefully some sort of recommendation at the July 7 meeting. Is that correct? Are we thinking of the timing wrong?
No, I think well, first of all, if we're going to go on the ballot, we have to have 2 readings before the first part of August, if I recall correctly. So, we really need, we're grateful if you can present our meeting and have a conversation with us. I think pretty much many of the things that were mentioned in the last 5 minutes regarding cuts, difficulty to pass a levy, the prospect of, if we don't go on, a double-digit millage in the following year. I think those are things that are important to be said. I mean, the numbers are the numbers. We can't change those, but I mean, I think it'll give some insight to the board members and staff that really need to work with the elected members to either persuade to put it on a ballot or not. So, I mean, one of the things Liz has to really, I mean, I don't think Liz knows the numbers, but if we have to go with a double, okay, let's say we don't do anything this year and we don't do any cuts this year and we have to go with double digit millage for next year, I mean, that's something that our CEO really has to understand and accept. And we as a board have to be comfortable with her understanding and accepting that. So I mean, I think you need to tell us everything you know.
Well, and to your question too, yes, the timing is that the readings have to be done, and I have to have things filed with the county if we are going to go on to November ballots. So they were required 2 readings by the board. So if the board has the conversation, if this committee meets next week and continues to kind of suss through whatever recommendations will be made, presents to the board on July 7th, the board can have their conversation. I'll have a template available for them for first reading if they would choose to do something like that. If they do decide they want to do something in November, we would have a blank a template with no millage or anything like that. The board could pass a resolution, and then the county has to do their certification, and then it would have to come back to the board a second time, which would be at their work session on the 21st. And then it would give me time then to go and get things filed at the county by August 5th. Obviously, if things need to change in between, but that's kind of the timeline, at least I feel like we're working with now, if there's something that's going to happen in November. If there's not, no issues. So
Scott, were you proposing the next meeting be another Zoom meeting, or has the district started using the boardroom? I mean,
no, the district's not has doing no meetings in person yet.
Okay.
So yeah, another Zoom meeting next Wednesday at 4, if that is reasonable and acceptable to everyone. Okay. All right, I'll make sure that Kathan gets the meeting out. Please feel free to reach out to me if there's other data you want to see in advance of that meeting that I can provide for you. I have the notes of what you asked for already. We'll send the meeting notice out for the month of July, probably tomorrow. So that meeting will be noticed then, July 1st, because we do notice these meetings. And I think we're good to go. Anything else for the good of the group at this time? All right, everyone. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. And we will see you next week.
Take care.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.